They said no man could hear the dying breath of a world. But he did. The sound wasn't a scream or an explosion. It was a long, drawn-out sigh, as if the planet itself had finally given up pretending it could be saved. The sky was a burning wound of ash and vaporized soil, the land beneath his boots trembling as orbital fire rained in slow, silent streaks. He couldn't remember how long he'd been running. Hours, days, maybe lifetimes. Somewhere behind him, the last Vox channel had fallen silent. No orders, no code phrases, no static. Just the whispering hum of the dead. He was a guardsman, just one of countless millions. A name once shouted over Lasfire, now forgotten by every record but his own fading memory. His regiment was gone, vaporized, shredded, devoured by the great machinery of war that the Imperium called duty. Yet somehow he was still breathing, still walking through the ruins that used to be his brothers' graves. Somewhere inside that broken helm, the thought echoed, why me? He carried no medals, no holy writs of valor, only a cracked lasgun, its power pack half dead and a faith too brittle to call belief. Around him, the world of Tarsus Secundus burned itself into a legend no one would tell. The Emperor's light did not shine here anymore, or perhaps it never had. But even in the choking dark, a man's heart could still remember the rhythm of a command voice, the warmth of comrades beside him, the unspoken oath to stand until the last. And so he walked. Through smoke and bone, through ruins older than memory, guided not by purpose, only by the unbearable weight of survival. For in the grim darkness of the far future, even a single guardsman can outlive the gods that sent him to die. If you've ever wondered what remains when the banners fall and the Emperor's light dims to embers, stay. The story of this lone guardsman is not about victory, but endurance. And endurance in this galaxy is the rarest kind of faith. Subscribe, if you will, to hear the tale of the last man of the 97th Vostroyan. One voice against the silence of extinction. The air was thick enough to taste. Metallic, bitter, the kind of air that scraped the inside of the throat and left a film of ash on the tongue. Once this place had been called Tarsus Secundus, a name spoken with pride by officers on parade, a name stamped on data slates and recruitment hymns, a name that had meant something in the grand lexicon of the Imperium. Now it was a corpse world, and like all corpses, it stank of memory and ruin. The guardsman moved through it as though through a half-remembered dream, his boots sinking into soot where soil had once been. Each step was a sound swallowed by the endless distance of collapse. He could no longer recall the day the bombardment began. Days had folded into nights without distinction. The horizon had been on fire for so long that even the sky seemed to bleed light. He remembered the first impact, the sound like the opening of the heavens, the shattering of hab blocks like glass towers, the storm of debris raining down with the precision of divine punishment. Men had screamed orders into vox links, their voices frantic, swallowed by static and smoke. Commissars had tried to rally the line, but the line itself had dissolved into dust. Regimental banners burned as the air turned to fire. Somewhere amid the confusion, the 97th Vostroyan had ceased to exist, and all the glorious oaths of loyalty and sacrifice became nothing more than whispers to a dead sky. Now there was only him, his lasgun hung from his shoulder, the charge pack blinking a slow dying pulse. A half-empty canteen rattled against his belt, its contents warm and tasting of rust. The once proud Vostroyan fur trim of his coat was blackened with soot and oil. He walked because standing still felt like surrender, and he could not bear the thought of dying on his knees. Around him the ruins stretched endlessly. The skeletons of manufactorums torn apart by orbital fire, the craters filled with molten slag, the corpses frozen mid-march, their eyes clouded with dust. The air shimmered with the faint heat of lingering radiation, and the wind carried with it the smell of promethium and charred flesh. He had seen men die 1,000 ways. Clean shots through the chest, slow rot from infection, the grotesque unmaking by Xenos claws or demon flame. But this was different. This was death as an idea, a philosophy, the kind of destruction that left nothing untouched, not even thought. The mind struggled to hold shape in it. He would wake sometimes with the taste of screams in his mouth, unsure if he had been dreaming or remembering. Voices still echoed in his skull, not supernatural, not psychic, just the cruel persistence of memory. Sergeant Karsov shouting for the heavy bolter to be redeployed, medic first-class Havel swearing under his breath as he tried to close another chest wound, the regimental chaplain reciting the Emperor's prayer as shells fell like rain. They were all gone now, but the mind is not kind enough to let go of ghosts. He had found shelter once in what had been an armored transport half buried in rubble. Inside, the scent of oil and burnt leather had been almost comforting. There were bones there too. 4 men, 1 woman, still clutching their lasguns. He had not disturbed them. He'd taken a ration pack, found it fused into its container, and eaten what could be scraped with a knife. For a brief moment he'd felt full. Then the emptiness returned, heavier than before. Hunger was not the worst of it. Hunger was simple. It was the silence that frightened him. The total absence of life, of machinery, of any sound save his own breath. In the Imperial Guard, silence meant one thing: that you were alone and the war had forgotten you. Once he had prayed. Not out of devotion but habit. The words had been beaten into him by the ecclesiarchy. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. But in the ruins of Tarsus Secundus, protection was a word without meaning, and provision was the cruel joke of the dead. He still whispered the words sometimes when the wind howled through the wreckage and the night seemed to move with purpose. It wasn't faith that made him do it. It was fear of what would happen if he stopped. The mind, after all, needs ritual to keep from collapsing. Even a prayer to an absent god was better than the silence that followed. He crossed what had once been a parade square, now a vast crater filled with the bones of tanks and men alike. The imperial aquila that had adorned the central statue lay broken in 2, its wings shattered. The stone beneath it was scorched black, the shape of the emperor's visage unrecognizable. He stopped there for reasons he couldn't name. Maybe respect, maybe exhaustion. He ran a gloved hand across the cracked marble, feeling the rough texture beneath the ash. Once this symbol had stood for unity, for the might of humanity bound by faith and purpose. Now it was just another ruin. He almost laughed at that, though the sound that left his throat was closer to a cough. The horizon flashed with distant fire. Somewhere beyond the clouds, orbital guns were still doing their grim work, methodically reducing what little remained of the surface. The guardsman stared up, trying to remember the constellations he had known as a child. There were none now, only the dull red glare of bombardment reflected through the storm. He felt small beneath it, smaller than he'd ever felt even in the heart of battle. In the regiment, surrounded by comrades, he had been one part of a greater whole. Now he was less than a whisper, a single pulse of life against a backdrop of annihilation. He found himself speaking aloud, if only to hear a human voice again. "If you're listening, my lord, you missed a few of us." His words vanished into the wind, carried off by the smoke. There was no answer. Not from heaven, not from the Vox. Only the distant groan of collapsing metal and the faint, rhythmic ticking of cooling rock. As night fell, though on Tarsus Secundus, the distinction between night and day had become meaningless. He crawled into the remains of a burned-out chimera and curled beneath a torn thermal blanket. He tried not to think of what might still be out there: scavenger beasts, corrupted men, the warped remains of what had once been human. Sleep came fitfully in broken fragments. He dreamed of parades, of shining armor, of the sound of marching boots on polished floors, then of screams and fire and silence. When he woke, the world had not changed. The ash still fell. The wind still moaned through the wreckage. But something in him had shifted, a small, terrible clarity. He realized that he was not waiting to be saved anymore. He was waiting to be forgotten, and that perhaps was worse. He stood, brushed the ash from his coat, and began to walk again. Toward where, he didn't know. Perhaps there was no toward anymore. Only forward, into the endless graveyard that had once been a world. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the dust and smoke, a shape moved. Too large to be a man, too fluid to be a machine. He froze, hand tightening on his lasgun. For the first time in days, he felt the pulse of his own heartbeat. Fast, uneven, alive. He couldn't tell if it was hope or fear that filled his chest. He blinked once. The shape was gone. Only the shadows remained. He whispered to himself the way a soldier does when no one else is left to listen. Still breathing, still here. Then he kept walking, through the bones of cities and the smoke of gods, through the world that died screaming. The silence had a shape now. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It pressed against the ears like a living thing, thick and heavy, coiling through the ruins with a kind of dreadful intent. The guardsmen had grown used to the noise of war, the roar of artillery, the thunder of tanks, the endless chant of orders through vox lines. But this quiet was wrong. It had rhythm. It waited between his footsteps, held its breath when he held his, and moved when he moved. It was no longer the peace after destruction. It was the breath before something else. He'd been walking through the wreckage of a manufactorum for what felt like hours. The great steel skeletons of conveyor belts hung frozen in place, their servitors long since melted into the floor. Cogitator banks blinked erratic green, still muttering binary prayers into the dark as though unaware their masters were dust. The walls were coated in soot and human shadows, the ghosts of those who had been caught in the plasma flash. He didn't look at them for long. The shapes had a way of shifting when he did. He'd scavenged a new charge pack from a corpse wearing the same Vostroyan colors as his own. He didn't recognize the face, which was good. Recognition meant grief, and grief had no place left to live. He checked the pack, slapped it into the lasgun, and moved on. Every sound seemed to echo too loud. The crunch of debris under boots, the creak of metal, the faint rasp of his breath through the rebreather filter. At some point, he realized that the echoes were delayed, slightly off, not in time with his movements. It was a small thing, but it made the skin on the back of his neck tighten. He stopped and listened. The manufactorum was still. Then, somewhere deep in the corridors ahead, something fell. A dull metallic clang like a dropped tool. The sound bounced through the tunnels, directionless. He raised the lasgun, thumb resting on the trigger guard. "Is anyone there?" he said, though he already knew the answer. A whisper answered him. Not a voice, more like a breath dragged through static. It came from a Vox unit built into the wall, still flickering weakly with residual power. He approached slowly, the beam of his lamp globe cutting through the haze. The Vox hissed again, forming fragments of syllables. He leaned closer. The words were distorted, warped by age and interference, but he caught one phrase clearly before it faded into white noise. "Still feeding." He froze. The unit sparked once, then went dark. His breath fogged the inside of his visor. For a moment the silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. He could feel something in it, a weight, a presence. He turned sharply, the lamp sweeping across the corridor. The light caught something on the wall, long scratches carved deep into the metal. Not random, not from shrapnel. 5 parallel grooves, each longer than his arm. He followed them with the beam, tracing their path down toward the floor, where the steel had been warped inward as though something massive had crawled through. He felt his heartbeat quicken. It wasn't orc work. It wasn't mechanical either. This was something else, something that had waited for the noise to stop before it began to move. He backed away slowly, forcing his breathing to stay quiet. The silence deepened again, so thick it felt like pressure against his skull. His boot brushed against something, a human skull half buried in ash. Its jaw was open, teeth blackened as though frozen mid-scream. He stepped over it and moved toward a broken stairwell leading upward. His lamp globe flickered once, twice, then died. The dark swallowed him whole. He stood there, blind, listening. Somewhere behind him something moved, a scrape of metal against stone, slow, deliberate. He didn't wait to find out what it was. He bolted up the stairs, lasgun clutched tight, lungs burning in the stale air. The steps creaked underfoot, sending echoes cascading through the manufactorum's hollow belly. At the top, he emerged into open air, or what passed for it on this world. The storm clouds above were a churning bruise of red and gray, and the wind howled across the shattered rooftops. He turned, scanning the stairwell entrance. Nothing followed. Nothing visible, at least, but the silence came with him, like a shadow that refused to stay behind. He knelt, catching his breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. The manufactorum stretched endlessly below, a labyrinth of twisted metal and collapsed gantries. From up here, it looked like a graveyard of titans. He remembered the old stories the veterans used to tell, about how the warp sometimes bled into the ruins of war zones, how sound could carry whispers that weren't truly sound at all. They said silence was never empty, that it had teeth if you lingered long enough. He used to laugh at that back when laughter had been possible. Now he wasn't so sure. He made camp beneath the remains of a collapsed crane that night, its massive hook dangling like a pendulum above him. The wind moaned through the cables, almost like a voice. He wrapped himself in his blanket, chewing on a strip of dried ration. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, from memory. When sleep came, it was not merciful. He dreamed of his regiment again, rows of faces beneath helmets, eyes staring forward, unblinking. He tried to call out, but his voice made no sound. One by one, the faces began to dissolve into ash. Then behind them he saw movement, a ripple in the smoke, a figure stepping through it. It was shaped like a man, but its eyes burned with faint, pale light and its mouth moved in perfect silence. When it raised its hand, he woke. He sat up, heart pounding, the dark around him absolute. The storm had quieted. Not a single sound reached his ears. Even the wind had stopped. He realized with cold certainty that the silence wasn't absence. It was waiting. He reached for the lasgun, holding it close. His eyes scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Yet beneath the ash and the ruin, something was alive. Something that had learned to feed not on flesh, but on the spaces between breaths, on the silence left behind when the last voice stopped speaking. He whispered to himself again, the only sound he could still make. Still breathing. Still here. But for the first time he wasn't sure if he believed it. And far below, deep in the bowels of the manufactorum, the Vox unit sparked to life once more, and whispered back. Still feeding. He began to hear them again after the third sunrise, though sunrise was a word that no longer meant what it once did. The sky above Tarsus Secundus had become a perpetual dawn of smoke and amber fire, the sun hidden behind the endless churn of ash clouds. The light that bled through was thin and sour like something half alive. He walked through it, weary and half-dreaming, until the world itself seemed to dissolve into noise and memory. That was when the first voice came back. It was Sergeant Karsov's voice, low, coarse, and unmistakably human. "Get that line secured, trooper. Emperor's blood, do I have to think for you?" The sound was so clear it made him stop mid-step. For a heartbeat, he thought there was another survivor nearby. But the air was empty, the ruins still. Only the echo of command lingered, as if the words had been carved into the atmosphere itself. He didn't answer. You didn't answer, ghosts. That was the rule the mind built for itself in such places. Still, the voice lingered behind him, fading with distance as though following the wind. He kept walking. Another voice soon joined it, the chaplain's, calm but fervent, reciting the benediction of the fallen. He had heard that litany 1,000 times on the line, but this time it was wrong. Certain words slipped. Pauses where there should have been rhythm. The prayer changed mid-verse, turning from supplication to accusation. He stopped again, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to force the sound away. But memory is not so easily commanded. The human mind is treacherous in isolation. Without others to measure against, it begins to fold inward, to devour itself. The guardsman knew this. He had seen men crack under quieter strains. The long sieges, the waiting. The nights when the enemy refused to come, but their presence was felt in every corner. Now he was alone, and the enemy had become the silence inside him. He told himself the voices were tricks of exhaustion, fragments of the brain trying to preserve what was left of familiarity. But as the day went on, the voices began to weave together, overlapping in strange harmonies. The captain shouting orders from the trenches, the Vox operator calling coordinates, the rhythmic click of lasfire from training drills, all of them layered atop one another, a chorus of memory turning into madness. He stumbled across a ruined bunker entrance, its walls half collapsed. The words 97th Vostroyan Recht, command post, were still visible through the grime. He stared at them for a long time before descending. Inside, the air was thick with rot and stale promethium. The light from his lamp revealed scattered Vox units, now dark and silent. A single pick slate flickered weakly on the floor, its surface cracked. When he touched it, static rippled across the display before resolving into a frozen image. The command team, gathered around a map table, their faces blurred by damage. He recognized them instantly. Karsov, Havel, even the chaplain. For a long moment he just watched. Then the image twitched. The captain's mouth moved, the faintest flicker of sound emerging from the broken speaker. A garbled loop of one word, played over and over. Hold. The guardsman's throat tightened. He remembered that word. It had been their last order, shouted across the Vox just before the bombardment cut everything to static. Hold the line. He hadn't realized until now how heavy those two syllables could be. He sat there for hours, or what felt like hours, the picked slate murmuring beside him. He began to speak to it quietly, as though to an old friend. He told it where he'd been, how he'd survived. He didn't expect an answer. But as the words left his mouth, the background static changed, a new frequency rising behind the distortion. The slate's image blurred again, and for a fraction of a second it wasn't the captain's face staring back at him. It was his own. He dropped the device. The sound cut off instantly. The bunker was silent again. Only his own breathing filled the space. He picked up the slate, shaking hands searching for some explanation. A trick of light, a glitch in the circuitry. But the screen had gone completely black. When he set it down again, something unexpected happened. His Vox bead, dead since the siege, crackled once in his ear. Trooper. Report. The voice was faint, barely more than static, but it was real. He froze, pressing a hand to the side of his helmet. This is Guardsman of the 97th Vostroyan. Repeat, this is Private. He stopped. His name caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't remember it. He pressed on anyway. If anyone can hear this, respond. Nothing. Only the thin whine of static. Then, just as he was about to remove the bead, the voice came again. Report. Position. He gave it, half believing, half dreaming. The Vox repeated his words back to him, perfectly mirrored. Every inflection, every pause. It wasn't a transmission. It was an echo. A recording of his own voice, bouncing back through some forgotten relay or, worse, through something that wanted him to believe it was listening. He tore the bead from his ear and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a sharp crack and went silent. He sat down against the cold concrete, exhaustion settling in. Still breathing, he muttered, as he always did. But this time the phrase felt hollow. The walls seemed to listen. The echoes that came back didn't sound like him. In the distance, deep within the manufactorum sprawl, the hum of machinery rose again, faint, intermittent, like a heartbeat returning after death. He thought of the captain's last order, of the word carved into his mind. Hold. Perhaps that was what he was doing now without realizing it. Holding the line between memory and madness, between the living and the dead. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids he saw them all again. The regiment lined up for inspection, the chaplain raising the Aquila in blessing, the sky clear and cold. But when he looked closer, every face turned toward him. Not with pride, not with brotherhood. With accusation. When he woke, his cheeks were wet. He didn't remember crying. He gathered his things and left the bunker behind. As he stepped into the ashen light, the air shifted, a low vibration that he felt more than heard. Somewhere below, something was moving. The earth trembled once, faintly. The silence was gone again. The world was waking up. He slung his lasgun and began to move toward the sound. If madness had found him, he would meet it standing. Because that was what the 97th had done. That was command. That was memory. That was duty. And duty was the last thing the dead could take from him. The tremors led him north, toward the buried industrial zones where the manufactoria sank into the planet's mantle. The ground here was fractured, veined with rivers of oil and half-melted rebar that shimmered like veins of metal beneath translucent skin. Every few kilometers, an explosion of light would bloom somewhere in the haze. Distant detonations or the flicker of malfunctioning plasma cores still bleeding energy into the void. He followed the vibration as one might follow a heartbeat in the dark, a faint rhythm that promised either sanctuary or damnation. By the second night, his rations were gone. He chewed on the corner of a field manual page to distract his stomach, the paper turning to paste against his tongue. When sleep came, it came in shards. Flashes of the trench line, the smell of wet mud and promethium, the soft click of lasgun safeties. He dreamt of the regiment's banner burning. When he woke, the wind had changed. It was blowing from below. The sinkhole was vast, a wound in the earth where the manufactorum's central lift shaft had collapsed. Around its rim, skeletal towers leaned inward like penitents over a grave. The vibration came from deep within, carrying up through the stone like the pulse of something alive. He knelt at the edge, peering down. The depths glowed with a faint crimson light. It was too regular to be magma, too rhythmic to be random. There was order there, mechanical, deliberate, ancient. He descended slowly, following the remnants of an elevator track. Halfway down, he saw shapes etched into the walls. Imperial sigils, purity seals, and beneath them, older carvings. These were not of the Mechanicus. They were rougher, primitive, depictions of men bowing before vast silhouettes haloed in fire. He traced one with his gloved hand, the stone warm beneath his touch. For the first time since the bombardment, he felt something that might have been awe or warning. At the bottom, he found the source of the sound. A cathedral. It was vast, built from blackened adamantium and fused stone, its architecture somewhere between manufactorum and monastery. The air shimmered with heat and machine chant. Cogitator nodes lined the walls, their screens pulsing faintly with red light. Great pipes curved like ribs overhead, exhaling steam in rhythmic sighs. In the center stood a pulpit, and upon it, impossibly, a priest. The man was kneeling in prayer, his body half mechanical, half decayed. Servo limbs protruded from his spine like broken wings. His mouth moved in silent litany, repeating words that no longer reached air. The guardsman approached, cautious, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous stillness. The priest did not react. He was long dead, but the machine that had been built into him still moved. Each whispered prayer was powered by the faint electrical pulse of the structure itself, a faith sustained by circuitry long after the flesh had failed. He circled the pulpit. At its base lay a book fused into the metal by heat. The pages were black, but the lettering still glimmered faintly, high Gothic though warped by fire. He could only make out fragments. Sanguis Imperatoris, Vox in Tenebris, blood of the Emperor, voice in the dark. The hum deepened. He turned. Across the cathedral floor, something stirred within the shadows, a shifting of metal and light. For an instant, he thought it was machinery reactivating, but then he saw a movement that was too fluid, too organic. A shape emerged, low and sinuous, dragging itself from beneath the pipes. It wasn't Xenos, not entirely, though its body was a hybrid of metal and flesh, an old servitor frame, reawakened, malformed, its original purpose corrupted beyond recognition. Tubes ran through its body like veins. Its face was featureless, the skin pulled taut across bone and steel. It moved toward him, hands scraping the floor, and in its chest cavity, something glowed, a fragment of Imperial circuitry still alive. The guardsman raised his lasgun but didn't fire. The thing wasn't attacking, it was trying to speak. The sound that came out was static, then words, filtered through the voice box of some long-dead soldier. "Hold the line." His heart froze. The servitor twitched violently, repeating the words, each iteration clearer than the last. "Hold the line. The Emperor sees." He fired then, a one-shot clean through the chest. The creature convulsed, light extinguished, and fell still. The echo of the gunshot reverberated through the chamber, shaking dust from the vaults above. When silence returned, he could hear something else. Faint voices, dozens of them, rising from the shadows. Some were human, some mechanical, all whispering the same thing. "Hold, hold, hold." He backed away, breath trembling. The whispers grew louder, filling the entire space until it seemed as if the very walls were alive with it. He stumbled toward the exit shaft, but as he reached the base of the climb, he turned once more. For a heartbeat, the dead priest was looking at him. Not with eyes, those were long gone, but with something else. The head had tilted just slightly, as though acknowledging him. He climbed then, faster than before, driven by terror and faith in equal measure. When he reached the surface, the tremors had ceased. The world above was still, silent once more. He collapsed at the edge of the pit, staring down into the darkness. The whispers still echoed faintly below, carried upward on the wind. He realized with a cold clarity that they weren't calling him back. They were praying, and they were praying to something that still listened. He sat there for a long time, the red light pulsing faintly beneath him, and for the first time since the fall of his regiment, he began to speak aloud, not to command, not to memory, but to whatever lingered in that cathedral beneath the earth. "Still breathing," he said softly, "still holding." And somewhere below, the darkness answered in kind. By the time the sun rose again, if the dim orange smear above the clouds could be called a sun, the guardsman had lost his sense of direction. The ruins stretched endlessly, a maze of broken hab-blocks and corroded ferrocrete bridges leading to nowhere. He walked through fog that smelled of ozone and rust, every breath cutting the back of his throat. Above him, flightless cherubs drifted like torn parchment caught in an unseen current, their vox grills whispering static hymns and fragments of Binharic prayer. He thought of the cathedral beneath the earth and wondered whether the voices he'd heard were still chanting, or whether the echoes had finally fallen silent. He knew better than to go back. Some truths are too heavy to carry twice. The city had once been a hive. He could tell from the slope of the streets, the collapsed transit rails, the towers leaning against each other like broken teeth. But it was pale now, bleached as if every surface had been scoured by fire and left to cool under the dust of centuries. He found no bodies, only outlines where men and machines had once stood, burned into the walls like ghosts caught mid-motion. The air shimmered faintly with radiation. His auspex flickered uselessly, giving readings that spiked and vanished as though the machine spirit inside was afraid to look too closely. He kept walking until he reached a plaza dominated by a single statue. It was enormous, an imperial saint, wings unfurled, sword raised toward the heavens. Her face had eroded, but the pose remained defiant, carved in the moment before victory or annihilation. At her feet lay a fountain long since dried, its basin filled with fine white ash. He knelt there and brushed some aside, revealing black glass underneath. When he looked closer, he saw that it wasn't glass at all. It was vitrified bone. A faint noise broke the silence. He froze. It came again, a rhythmic clatter of metal on stone, slow and deliberate. He rose, lasgun ready, scanning the haze. From between two shattered archways came a figure, tall and cloaked in gray. The stranger moved like a ghost, footsteps echoing far too loudly for a man that seemed so slight. When the fog thinned, the guardsman saw the robes of a tech priest, though the insignia were faded and the body beneath looked far too lean. The priest's face was veiled by an oxidized respirator mask, tubes snaking into a satchel of humming devices strapped across his chest. The guardsman raised his weapon. "Identify yourself," he said, voice cracking from disuse. The priest stopped. A pause, then a static-ridden reply. "Not enemy." "Not yet." The words came filtered, almost human beneath the distortion. The guardsman lowered his aim by a fraction, though his finger stayed near the trigger. The priest tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You're Imperial," he said. "You bleed. You breathe. That's rare. Survivor," the guardsman said. "Valoran 9th. "Valoran," the priest repeated as if testing the word. "A regiment without graves. You're far from your lines." "There are no lines," the guardsman said. "Not anymore." A quiet whir passed through the air as the priest approached, robes brushing the ground like whispering parchment. He circled the guardsman slowly, scanning him with a flickering data slate. "Radiation damage minimal. Cognitive stability uncertain. You're walking on consecrated ruin, soldier. This city died before your regiment ever set foot on this world." The guardsman frowned. "Impossible." "Nothing is impossible," the priest murmured. "Only misrecorded." They stood in silence, the wind sighing through hollow towers. Finally, the priest gestured toward the statue. "Do you know her name?" The guardsman shook his head. "Saint Athelia," the priest said. "She burned with her followers when the reactors went critical. The ash you tread upon is her congregation. They said the saint's shadow still moves at dusk. I've never seen it, but the sensors sometimes scream when the light fades." He turned his masked face toward the horizon where the sun was sinking. "You should not linger here when night comes. There are processes that still repeat, machines that remember their purpose long after the flesh forgot." The guardsman hesitated. "And you?" "I remain to listen," the priest said simply. "The city still speaks. Someone must hear." The words hung in the air like incense. The guardsman didn't know whether to believe him, but there was no malice in the man's tone, only exhaustion. Together they sat by the fountain as the light dimmed, watching the pale dust swirl in the growing gloom. Somewhere deep below the plaza, engines rumbled faintly, like beasts turning in their sleep. When full night came, the statue of the saint began to glow, not with fire or electricity, but with something softer, an inner luminescence that painted the square in cold white light. The guardsman rose, stunned. The priest merely bowed his head. "She wakes," he whispered. "Every night she wakes." The guardsman stepped closer. The statue's face, once eroded, seemed whole again. The eyes burned with light, and for an instant he thought they turned toward him. The ash at her feet shifted, swirling as though stirred by breath. The priest began to chant softly in Binharic, each note vibrating through the air with mechanical precision. The guardsman felt something stir within him, a mingling of dread and reverence. For the first time, he wondered whether survival had been a mercy or a test. The saint's radiance grew brighter until the plaza was drowned in white. He shielded his eyes, and when he lowered his hand, the light was gone. The statue was stone once more. The city silent again. He turned to the priest, but the man was gone. Only the faint hum of machinery remained. The guardsman looked down at his hands, at the thin layer of ash that had settled there. It glowed faintly, fading like embers. He whispered a prayer he barely remembered, one taught long ago before the war, when faith still felt like something more than desperation. The words trembled as they left his lips, swallowed by the cold air. Somewhere far above, thunder rolled across the horizon, though no storm followed. He lifted his gaze toward the sound and saw the clouds parting to reveal something vast, an orbital silhouette, silent and dead, drifting like a tomb across the sky. It bore the Aquila still, though its wings were broken, and beneath that emblem of ruin, the lone guardsman felt smaller than he ever had before. The pale city receded behind him as he moved on, leaving only the faint phosphorescence of its haunted plazas glowing dimly through the haze. For hours he walked without direction, guided by instinct and a deep wordless pull, something between compulsion and calling. The terrain shifted again, the brittle ferrocrete giving way to cracked glass plains where the earth had fused under ancient bombardment. Every step rang hollow, echoing for seconds before dying in the distance. There was no wind here, only stillness so complete that even the sound of his own breathing felt intrusive. He stopped when he saw it. A tower rose from the horizon like the broken tooth of some vast god machine, its top lost in the clouds. Around its base sprawled a labyrinth of half-submerged forges, still glowing faintly from within. The heat rolling off them made the air shimmer, distorting the world into a rippling mirage. He approached cautiously, lasgun held low, and soon realized the scale. What he had taken for debris were servitors, thousands of them, inert and half-buried in molten slag. Their bodies were twisted in prayer, faces upturned, mouths open in frozen worship. Some still moved faintly, driven by the residual charge of forgotten commands. At the tower's entrance, a vast, cog-toothed door loomed open. A faint hymn echoed from within, mechanical voices repeating a binary psalm over and over like static caught in eternal loop. He entered. The light inside was red and pulsing, emanating from vertical slits that ran along the corridor walls. Steam hissed intermittently from vents overhead, and each sound seemed amplified by the hollow acoustics of the place. It smelled of oil, dust, and something older, like iron left too long beneath blood. The walls were carved with litanies of the Omnissiah, etched in both High Gothic and Binharic code. Between the inscriptions, human bones had been worked into the structure itself, forming patterns of devotion that made his skin crawl. He descended deeper until he reached the chamber at the core of the tower. There, a machine heart still pulsed. Its design was beyond comprehension. Part reactor, part altar, part organism. Cables as thick as a man's torso coiled around it like serpents. At its center was a shape, human in outline but metallic, suspended by a web of conduits that vanished into the walls. Its chest rose and fell slowly, though no breath escaped. The guardsman couldn't tell whether it was alive or dreaming. A voice broke the silence. "Step forward." He spun, lasgun raised, but the voice did not come from behind. It came from everywhere, reverberating through the metal around him. "You are not of the Mechanicus," it said. "Yet you enter Sanctum unbidden." The guardsman swallowed hard. "Who speaks?" "I am Remnant," the voice replied. "I am memory. I am what remains of the forge." The suspended figure stirred slightly, head tilting toward him. "You carry heat. You carry pulse. You are rare." He hesitated, unsure if the thing was addressing him or the idea of him. "I'm a soldier," he said. "Valoran 9th, I seek—" "I don't even know what anymore." "Purpose," the machine answered. "You seek purpose in the aftermath." He wanted to deny it, but the word struck too close. He lowered his weapon slowly. "If you know what happened here, tell me. Why does the city whisper? Why does the ground hum with ghosts?" The cables shivered, a sound like breath passing through distant vents. "Because faith is circuitry," it said softly. "Because devotion does not die when flesh does." The Omnissiah listened still, though his priests have long since fallen silent. "You have walked through his memory." The guardsman stepped closer to the figure. Its face was covered by a bronze mask shaped like an idealized human visage, featureless save for a single vertical slit where the mouth should be. Through it, faint light flickered. "What are you?" he asked. "An echo," it said. "A fragment of the machine god's choir. When the forge fell, my kind were erased, but the prayers were too strong, the data too sacred. I endure. I wait for the next pulse of creation. And what do you want from me? To listen, the machine said. To remember. The human tongue forgets, but the human heart does not. You still carry his spark, though you do not know its name. The guardsman felt a strange pressure in his chest, like something was resonating within him, his heartbeat syncing with the tower's rhythm. If this is faith, he said, voice hoarse, then it's madness. All faith is madness, the voice replied, almost gently. Only some are holy enough to survive it. The chamber trembled suddenly. Sparks cascaded from the ceiling. The tower was waking or dying. The machine's voice deepened. Go, it said. You cannot stay. The forge reclaims what enters. The process is beginning again. What process? Rebirth, it whispered. Or ruin. The difference is only scale. He turned and ran. Behind him, the chamber filled with light. Gold at first, then red, then blinding white. The voices of the servitors outside rose in chorus, static and code fusing into one vast metallic scream. The guardsman stumbled through the corridors, vision swimming. When he emerged into the open, the tower's apex was already collapsing inward. A sun dying in slow motion. Molten glass rained from the sky. He ran until he could no longer feel his legs, until the horizon swallowed the ruin behind him. When he finally fell to his knees, gasping, the sound that escaped him was neither prayer nor curse, but something in between. A laugh twisted into sobbing. In the distance, the glow faded. The tower was gone, only the echo remained, faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic pulse of a machine heart somewhere deep within the planet, still beating long after its god had forgotten it. He whispered the word aloud, unsure whether he was mocking it or honoring it. Omnissiah. And then he was alone again when dawn came again, or what passed for dawn on this dying world. It arrived, as a gray smudge bleeding into a darker gray sky. The guardsman had not slept. He sat on a ridge of fused earth, staring at the horizon where the tower had once stood. Now there was only a crater, and from that crater, faint gold light pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat muffled beneath the planet's crust. He had expected fear, or perhaps awe, but what he felt instead was a numb clarity. The world was hollowing itself from within, reshaping into something neither alive nor dead. He rose and began to walk. The air grew colder with every step. The landscape had changed again, flat now, littered with the remains of ancient pilgrim convoys, burned-out crawlers, prayer wheels twisted into grotesque forms, and banners so old their inscriptions had faded into smears. Among them he found bones, perfectly arranged, as though each skeleton had simply knelt and turned to dust mid-prayer. The sight filled him with a strange calm. There was order in this extinction, a pattern he couldn't quite decipher. By midday he reached a plateau overlooking a great plain of cracked basalt. At its center lay a structure that did not belong, smooth, pale, and vast, half buried in the ground. Its geometry was too precise, its edges too sharp, gleaming faintly even in the diffuse light. He felt the same unease he had once felt on the battlefield, the intuition soldiers know before artillery strikes, that whatever he saw ahead was older and more deliberate than war. He approached cautiously. As he drew nearer, he saw that the structure was not built by human hands. It was Xenos in design, though time had warped it beyond clear identification. Glyphs covered its surface, lines that seemed to shift when he tried to follow them. The air hummed with static energy. He felt it against his skin like static before a lightning strike, and in the midst of that alien silence he felt something familiar. A whisper, not from without but within. It was a voice he had not heard since his earliest days of service, the voice that came in moments of desperation when men cried to the throne. The voice of the Emperor, or perhaps only the echo of belief shaped into language by the human mind. Do not kneel. The words were not sound, not exactly. They reverberated through his skull, threading through his nerves, bypassing thought. He staggered back, heart hammering. Do not kneel, the voice repeated, colder now, more human. You are not yet ash. He turned in a slow circle, lasgun raised, but there was no one there. Only the shifting glyphs glowing faintly with the color of dying stars. What are you? He whispered. The air rippled, and for a moment the structure seemed to breathe. Light moved through it in patterns too fast for his eyes to follow. The voice came again, softer now, threaded with something like sorrow. I am what remains when faith outlasts form. I am what they built when they no longer remembered why. The guardsman shook his head. You're not him. No, it said. But I am the echo of what you think he is. I am the shadow cast by his silence, and you, mortal, you carry a fragment of that silence within you." He fell to his knees despite the command not to, the weight of the words pressing against him like gravity. "Why me?" he asked. "Why leave me alive when the rest are gone?" "Because you remember," the voice said, "and remembrance is dangerous. Memory is contagion. The throne feeds upon it." The phrase cut through him like shrapnel. He had heard many interpretations of the Emperor's will in his time, some whispered by chaplains, others preached by madmen, but never like this. "What are you saying?" Faith sustains him, but every prayer is also a wound. Every soul that remembers his light feeds the fire that binds him to the throne. "You live because you have not yet decided whether you believe or not. You are equilibrium. You are noise between signals." The glyphs around him brightened until the light was blinding. He felt the ground shift beneath his knees as though the plane itself were breathing. Then, as quickly as it began, the light faded. The voice was gone. Only the faint hum remained, vibrating through his bones. He stood unsteadily, eyes burning from the afterimage. The structure was still there, but its surface had gone dark again, the glyphs now inert. He touched the metal, if it was metal, and found it warm. Beneath his palm, something pulsed once, then went still. He whispered the Emperor's name, not as a soldier's prayer, but as a question, and the sound of it seemed to vanish into the air, devoured by the silence. He realized then that he could not tell whether what he'd heard was truth or delusion. Perhaps it was only his mind fracturing after too long in solitude. Perhaps it was the Emperor himself, or the echo of some ancient Xenos intelligence repurposing his faith for its own ends. He turned away, and as he did, the horizon flickered. For a heartbeat, he saw shapes moving in the distance, silhouettes of men in armor, golden and immense, striding through the ash with their weapons lowered. The custodes, he thought, though that was impossible. They belonged to Terra, not this forgotten grave world. The vision faded before he could be sure it had ever been real. When the darkness fell again, he made camp beneath a half-collapsed arch and stared into the dead fire of his ration lamp. He thought of the whisper, of the voice that claimed to be an echo. If the Emperor's will truly resonated through all creation, perhaps even echoes could save or destroy, and so he slept, dreaming of the throne's golden light burning through the void, and the countless souls who fed its fire without knowing what they sustained. In his dream, he walked toward it one step at a time, until the light became too bright to bear and the world dissolved into nothing but the sound of a single heartbeat, still beating somewhere in the dark. When the guardsman awoke, the world was silent again. Not the silence of sleep nor the uneasy quiet that precedes gunfire, but the absolute stillness of a place that has forgotten what sound is. His breath fogged in the air, and the pale light filtering through the ash made everything appear submerged, as though the land itself had sunk beneath an ocean of dust. He rose slowly, feeling the ache in his limbs, the stiffness in his back. His body was still human, but his mind had begun to drift toward something else, some state between devotion and madness. He began walking again, not toward any landmark, but in the direction where the light beneath the earth had last pulsed. Each step stirred a faint whisper from the ash, and as he moved, he realized he was following footprints that were not his own. They were deep, deliberate, and impossibly large, each impression shaped like the soul of power armor. He followed them for what felt like hours until they led him to the edge of a great hollow. There he saw them, a circle of golden giants standing motionless around a crater. Custodes, or what remained of them. Their armor was dulled by centuries of dust, but it still caught the weak light in glimmers of faded glory. They were statues or corpses or something between the two. Each one held a spear point down in the ground, their visors locked toward the center of the crater, as if they were still on guard duty after death. The guardsman approached, his heart pounding. He had seen custodes once before during a brief posting near Terra, but only from a distance. To stand before them now felt like standing before myth. He reached out and touched one of their armored greaves. The surface was warm. Beneath his fingers, something vibrated faintly like a trapped current of power still trying to escape. Then from the crater's center came a low, resonant hum. He turned. There, half buried in the ashen soil, lay a throne, not of gold but of blackened stone. Upon it sat a figure in tattered robes, its flesh long gone, its face hidden behind a cracked mask of porcelain. A faint golden light seeped through the fissures in the mask, pulsing with the same rhythm as the light beneath the planet's crust. For a moment, the guardsman could not move. His mind refused to assign meaning to what he saw. The figure was not alive, but neither was it entirely dead. The air around it shimmered with residual energy, thick and heavy as if time itself hesitated to touch the thing seated upon the throne. He took a step forward. The hum deepened. One of the custodes moved. It was not a full movement, just the faintest turn of the head, the slightest twitch of metal upon metal, but it was enough to send terror racing through him. He froze. The custode's visor flared dimly, revealing nothing within. Then a sound emerged. Not speech, not breath, but the dry scrape of static forming words. The vigil endures. The guardsman swallowed, his mouth dry. "Who do you watch?" he asked quietly. The voice came again, fractured and ancient. The throne. Always the throne. He looked back at the corpse upon the black throne and felt the terrible weight of realization. These custodes had not abandoned their post. They had remained where they were ordered, standing watch over a relic that had outlived its purpose. Perhaps they no longer remembered the Emperor's name. Perhaps their vigilance had become its own form of damnation. He stepped closer, drawn by a force he could not resist. The light from the cracked mask brightened, spilling across his boots. The hum became a deep rhythmic throb that seemed to match his heartbeat. For an instant he felt as if the entire world was breathing in unison with the thing before him. Then he heard it again, the voice that had haunted him since the ruins. "You see now," it said, not from the throne but from within his skull. "Faith and death are mirrors. They watch each other endlessly." He fell to his knees, not in worship but in despair. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered. "Remember," the voice said. "That is enough." The air grew colder. The hum subsided. The light faded from the throne and the custodes froze once more, resuming their eternal vigil. The guardsman sat there for a long time, staring at the dead watchers, until the last pulse of gold flickered out. He rose at last and turned away. There was nothing left to guard, nothing left to believe in, yet somehow the act of witnessing had become sacred in itself. He began to walk again, not toward salvation but simply forward, into the endless plain of dust. Behind him the silent sentinel stood unmoving beneath the dying sky. As he walked, he began to hum an old marching song, barely remembering the words. His voice cracked and the sound faded quickly in the wind, but it was enough to remind him that he still existed. The horizon shimmered, and far ahead, where the gray met the black, he thought he saw the faint outline of another figure walking toward him. Small, human, indistinct. He blinked, and it was gone. The world turned quiet once more. Somewhere beneath the surface, the light pulsed once, softly, like a heartbeat that refused to die, and above it all, unseen and unfelt, the echo of the Emperor's dream lingered, neither promise nor curse, but something vast and unfinished waiting for another soul to remember. The vigil endures.